Over the last 150 years, every major financial disaster has destroyed countries the same way. The debt gets too big, the government prints too much money, and the people in charge make undisciplined decisions. Argentina, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Lebanon, Weimar Germany, the list is long and it keeps getting longer. But there are 5 countries that managed to dodge this pattern, and not just once. They survived world wars, hyperinflations, oil crises, and a global pandemic, and every single time they came out with minimal damage. In this video, you'll see the patterns and the reasons why Switzerland, Singapore, Norway, Germany, and Botswana are each uniquely remarkable when it comes to protecting wealth and economic stability. Watch this all the way through. Every country on my list used a completely different method, which honestly makes this breakdown even more interesting. My personal favorite is Singapore, but I'd love to hear yours in the comments. First country, Switzerland. And the question worth starting with is simple. How does a country the size of a U.S. state manage to stay one of the most stable economies on the planet for over 200 years? The 20th century destroyed half of Europe. 2 world wars, hyperinflations, revolutions, occupations. The continent went through everything, and Switzerland sat right in the middle of all that chaos and didn't participate in a single conflict. Not because it got lucky with geography. Belgium is also a small neutral country, and it got occupied twice. Switzerland turned neutrality into something bigger than just a political stance. It made it an economic strategy. Here's what that looked like in practice. While Germany, France, and Britain were spending everything on war, printing money, and piling on debt, Switzerland was accumulating. The Swiss franc was tied to gold all the way until the year 2000, one of the last currencies in the world to hold that anchor. That meant the government physically could not print more money than there was gold in the vaults, and that kept the currency stable for decades while neighboring currencies were falling apart one after another. The Swiss central bank still holds some of the largest gold reserves per capita in the world. When banks were collapsing across Europe and America in 2008, the franc didn't weaken, it strengthened. Investors from all over the world ran to the Swiss currency because behind it stood 200 years of consistent decisions, not campaign promises from politicians. And that's the key point. Switzerland didn't become stable overnight. It built that reputation over centuries, one decision at a time, one crisis at a time. Neutrality, the gold standard, banking discipline, refusing to get dragged into other people's conflicts. Each of those decisions on its own looks simple, but together they created a financial fortress that no crisis in the 20th century could breach. But I want to be honest. The Swiss model isn't universal. It's a small country with a unique history and geography, and you can't just copy the playbook. Plus, neutrality works as long as people leave you alone, and that's never guaranteed. Switzerland's principle is straightforward. Don't get involved in other people's crises, build up your reserves, and earn trust over decades. Sounds simple, but almost nobody does it. Second country, Singapore. And this might be the most incredible story out of all 5. In 1965, Singapore didn't become independent. It got kicked out. Malaysia literally expelled it from the Federation, and Kuan Yew, the prime minister at the time, cried on camera announcing it. That's not a metaphor. The footage exists. Here's what Singapore had at that point. No oil, no gas, no minerals, no farmland. An island half the size of Los Angeles with no fresh water of its own. They bought it from Malaysia, and no military worth mentioning. By every economics textbook in the world, this was a country that was supposed to fail. 1 generation later, Singapore became one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. GDP per capita today is higher than the United States, Germany, or Japan. How? Kuan Yew did 3 things that almost nobody else was willing to do. First, he bet on the rule of law instead of natural resources. Corruption was punished severely. Contracts were enforced. Courts actually worked. That sounds basic, but look at the list of oil-rich countries that went broke despite having everything. What they were missing was exactly this. Second, he turned the country into a hub. If you don't have resources, become the place where other people's resources, money, and goods pass through. Singapore became the trade, finance, and logistics center of all of Southeast Asia, not because it had something to sell, but because it was convenient and safe to do business through. Third, sovereign wealth funds. GIC and Temasek today manage well over $1 trillion combined. A country with zero natural resources has accumulated more reserves than most oil-producing nations on the planet. And here's what matters. This approach has been stress-tested more than once. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 wiped out Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea. Singapore held. 2008 held. COVID. The economy dipped, but recovered faster than most developed countries. Singapore's net financial position is deeply positive. Its sovereign wealth funds and reserves are estimated at 3 to 4 times the country's annual GDP, far exceeding those of many resource-rich nations. There is a flip side. Singapore was built on an authoritarian model, tight control, restricted freedoms, pragmatism over idealism. Not every society is willing to make that trade-off, and not every society should be. But the result speaks for itself. A country with nothing that turned itself into something everyone needs. Singapore's principle: if you don't have anything, become what everyone needs. Third country, Norway. And this is the story of how the only oil-rich country on Earth managed not to blow through its own wealth. In 1969, they found oil in the North Sea. For a small Scandinavian nation of 5 million people, this was a jackpot. Suddenly, Norway had a resource that could make it fabulously wealthy. And here's where Norway separated itself from every other country that's ever struck oil. Venezuela found oil, and today people are starving. Nigeria found oil, and most of the population lives below the poverty line. Saudi Arabia found oil, and is spending trillions trying to diversify before the wells run dry. Libya, Iraq, Angola, resources everywhere, stability nowhere. Norway did the one thing almost nobody else did. It didn't spend the money. In 1990, the government created the Government Pension Fund Global, which today is known as the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. As of right now, it holds roughly $1.9 trillion for 5 million people. That comes out to something like $350,000 per Norwegian citizen, including newborns. But the most interesting part isn't the size of the fund, it's the rules it operates under. Norway established what they call the fiscal rule. The government can only spend the expected real return on the fund, roughly 3% a year, not the principal, not oil revenues directly, just the investment profits, and not even all of those. In 2008, the fund lost 23% of its value. The global financial crisis hit everyone, including Norway. You know what the government did? Nothing. Didn't sell, didn't panic, didn't change the strategy. Within 2 years, the fund recovered and kept growing. During COVID, same story. The cushion allowed them to avoid printing money and piling on debt, which is what nearly every other country resorted to. And that's the whole difference. It's not about the oil. Dozens of countries have oil. The difference is discipline. The decision not to spend what you could spend. The willingness to say no today so you can say yes 30 years from now. There are weak spots. Norway is still heavily dependent on oil and gas, and the transition to green energy creates long-term risks. Plus, political pressure to dip into the fund is always there. So far, they've managed to resist it, but that's not guaranteed forever. Norway's principle: if you've got the resources, don't eat through them. Save, invest, and spend only the returns. Fourth country, Germany. And this is the only one on the list that's here, not because it avoided a catastrophe, but because it lived through one twice and built an economy designed to never let it happen again. 1923. I've already talked about the Weimar Hyperinflation in other videos, when people were burning banknotes for heat and a pig farmer was trading a hog for a grand piano. The mark collapsed to zero. The middle class was wiped out, and people who'd saved their entire lives found themselves broke within months. Germany did something that almost no country does after hyperinflation. It carried out a brutal reform. The Rentenmark, then the Reichsmark, a new currency with a hard peg, rebuilding trust from the ground up. Not gradually, not let's see how it goes, fast and painful. Then World War II. The country in ruins, the economy dead, the Reichsmark worthless. And once again, the same test. A currency nobody trusts. An economy that doesn't function. In 1948, Ludwig Erhard did something most economists at the time considered insane. He simultaneously introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, and lifted most price controls in one day. Historians call it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Shops that had been empty for years filled with goods practically overnight, because people finally had money they could trust and prices that told the truth. But the most important thing didn't happen in 48. It happened over the following decades. Germany created the Bundesbank, a central bank that for 50 years was the most hawkish in Europe. Low inflation at any cost, no compromises, because a nation that lost everything twice to currency debasement was never going to let it happen again. And that trauma is still embedded in the culture today. Germans still prefer cash, still don't like debt, and still treat inflation not as an economic statistic, but as a personal threat, because their grandparents and great-grandparents knew firsthand what happens when the government starts printing. There is a serious caveat. With the introduction of the euro, Germany lost control of its own monetary policy. The European Central Bank prints for the entire Eurozone, and Germany can no longer single-handedly enforce the discipline it maintained with the Bundesbank. That's a real vulnerability, and it hasn't gone away. Germany's principle, a country that's been through the worst, builds an economy that can survive the worst. The memory of disaster is the best protection against its repeat. And the fifth country, Botswana. I put it last on purpose because it demolishes the most common myth about financial stability. The idea that you need to be rich to achieve it. 1966. Botswana gains independence from Britain. At that point, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. 12 kilometers of paved roads in the entire nation. Virtually zero infrastructure, GDP per capita, on par with the most impoverished African states. Then they found diamonds. And normally this is where the story turns into a chapter about corruption, civil war, and stolen resources. Sierra Leone, blood diamonds. Congo, decades of conflict over minerals. Zimbabwe, right next door, literally a neighboring country, had resources and ended up in an economic catastrophe. Botswana went a different way. The government struck a partnership with De Beers on equal terms. It didn't sell off the rights for pennies like many African nations did, but insisted on a fair split of the revenue. The diamond money went into education, healthcare, and infrastructure, not into palaces for the elite. Since independence, Botswana has remained a stable democracy, the only one in the region without coup, without dictatorships, without civil wars. One of the highest GDP growth rates in the world over the past 50 years, a country that started with 12 kilometers of road. And here's why this matters for this video. Switzerland was rich. Singapore became rich within a generation. Norway found oil. Germany is one of the largest economies in the world. You could chalk up their success to resources, geography, or luck. You can't do that with Botswana. It started from zero in the poorest region on Earth, next to countries that had the same resources and lost everything. The only thing it had that was different was the decisions made by the people in charge. And that's the most important takeaway from all 5 stories. It was never about the resources, never about the geography, and never about luck. It was about decisions. Botswana is living proof. Botswana's principle, it's not about what you have, it's about what you do with it. 5 countries, 5 completely different stories. But if you look at them together, 5 principles emerge that keep showing up again and again. First, don't get involved in other people's crises. Switzerland spent 200 years staying out of other nations' wars and conflicts, while everyone around them went broke fighting them. This applies to more than just countries. Every time you put money into something you don't understand or react to someone else's panic, you're participating in someone else's crisis. Second, if you don't have resources, become the resource. Singapore had nothing and turned itself into what everyone else needed. A person who has no capital but has skills does exactly the same thing, becomes someone others can't do without. Third, if you've got resources, don't eat through them. Norway found oil and didn't spend it. Anyone who puts away income instead of burning through it is following the same principle, just on a personal scale. Fourth, if you've survived a disaster, build so it doesn't happen again. Germany burned twice, and after that created the most disciplined financial culture in Europe. A person who lost money in a crisis and then overhauled their approach is doing exactly the same thing. And fifth, it's not about wealth, it's about decisions. Botswana proved that you can start from zero and still not lose. That works for countries, and it works for people. 5 principles. None of them require luck, resources, or genius. All 5 require one thing: discipline. Which of these 5 principles are you already applying, and which one are you ignoring? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. I break down these patterns every week. Subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.